I never thought that it would be this creepy up here. I crossed a couple of fence lines that said no trespassing, so I'm not going to identify where it is that I'm sitting at the moment. I will say that it's pretty scary sitting here. I don't know how long I'm going to be able to stay here because the wind is blowing and it just doesn't seem stable. Listen to this. I wanted to pick an interesting location for a review of some of the information that we have in the Lilly Bartels Mystery. And there's something that I haven't talked about before that is really important to the whole story, but I want to give it in sequence. I guess the best way to start is to go over how it is that we identified the grave of Lilly Bartels. Lilly was born July 22nd, 1894, and she died September 5th, 1899. That's according to the grave marker. That gravestone was pointed out to us on October 24th, 2008, when a model who was working with me in the cemetery stopped modeling and said she had picked up on some kind of entity that was on the fence line. And she didn't see the entity, but she talked about the entity being upset about some injustice. So the model looked around the cemetery and zeroed in on this particular grave, Lilly Bartels' grave. I videotaped that because we were making a video at the time. I had the equipment there. Man, this is a scary place to be. I don't know if I should stay. Well, we'll try to. I'll stay as long as I can, but it's the whole place is moving. As the wind blows, it's moving. And it just doesn't sound safe. It doesn't feel safe. Actually feel the floor moving. And I'm kind of high up. So Lilly's grave was originally pointed out on October 24, 2008. And then on May 6, 2015, I was there at the cemetery with another individual, another friend. She felt her ankle get touched as we were in the cemetery. We thought it was a bug or a weed, whatever, but who knows what it was. But the sensation occurred to her pretty close to Lilly Bartels' grave. Now, there's a series of graves. You've got, coming from the south, you've got Emma Bartels, the mother, Herman Bartels, the father. Then you've got Alex and Ida Bartels, and they share a grave. There's a single headstone. And they died in the 1890s, and they were young children. One was 2 years old, one was 4 years old. Then as you go from there toward the north, and these are all very close to each other, you find Lilly Bartels' grave. That grave seemed to be important. In 2016, on October 24th, I was there with another model shooting some pictures for the newspaper, and she heard noises over in that corner of the cemetery. And then later on, she said she saw a woman walking fast. It scared her so badly that she started crying. So I believe that those incidents are all related to the same situation, same grave, same entity. This whole thing got bizarre when the second individual went home on May 7th, 2015, and she had the first of a series of dreams. Now, what's interesting in those dreams is that we're getting clues. we learned that it was taking place in the fall because the leaves looked like fall leaves and they were crunching underneath her feet. It was cool. In September, typically, it generally is not that cool here in Texas, but when we looked up in the weather archives, it turns out that 1899 was an extremely cold year. It was so cold that Galveston Bay, they reported that it actually froze. And that's cold for Texas when you have freezing water on the coast. In the dream, the lady was wearing warm clothes, a wool cloak. The man at the river, he had a newsboy cap on. A newsboy cap was popular at that time in this country. In the 1890s, early 1900s, people wore newsboy caps, especially people who worked in the railroad business. He was bending over, this gentleman that was seen in the dream was bending over, and he had no pockets in his trousers, in the back of his pants. Well, that also points to clothing of that period. Back pockets didn't come till later. He was wearing a coat. It was not a working man's coat. It was like a suit coat that a person would wear if he was a businessman. He was flailing with something in a creek, not the river, not the Guadalupe River, but a creek. And that dream also gave us the name Jacob, which was said, Jacob. There were other dreams where that person, that man, was said to be extremely strong, much like a railroad worker or somebody associated in the railroad business. He had a musky smell about him, not sure what that means exactly. He covered the subject, who we believe is Emma, covered her face with an oily cloth that in the dream is reported to be like an oily cloth you find in a train yard. And this is before, that was said before anybody thought that there might be a connection to the railroad. In the walking dream, there was a long, gravel, straight road. And I thought, why would they make a road in 1899? Because we're guessing this is 1899. We're trying to pin it down. Why would they make a road that's straight and it's made out of gravel? There were no cars. People pulling wagons did not pull their wagons on gravel roads. That would be hard to do. The animals couldn't get a grip, and it just makes no sense that there would be a long, straight gravel road. Except when you realize that railroad beds were made of gravel. Not always. Back at that time, they were slapping railroad ties just right on the dirt. But in some cases, they were putting down a base, a gravel base. That also is a railroad connection. This couple, this man and woman, this is the man that was wearing a newsboy cap, had his suit coat over his arm. He was carrying it. He was wearing suspenders, and he had no face. That was revealed in the dream. Individual who we think is Emma looked up at him and he has no face. So for some reason this face is being hidden from us. In the earlier dream where he pushes her down on the ground, pins her on the ground and puts an oily cloth over her face, she's not able to see his face. We don't see his face when he's flailing in the river. And in a walking dream they're carrying on a conversation. The original point of view is back behind them. You can't see their faces, and then when the point of view changes to be inside the woman, she looks up and his face is blank. There's a hat floating in the air and there's shoulders and there is no face. We're not sure what that means. Now, one of the questions that we've asked since we heard the name Jacob is, who is Jacob? One of the things I did is I went to the cemetery. It was late at night, and I stood at the gate and I called out into the cemetery, "Wo ist Jacob's Nachname?" What is Jacob's last name? Because we didn't know. All we had from the dream was Jacob. When I went to the county clerk's office and asked that question, one of the clerks agreed to help me, and she found in the book the old records written in the 1800s. She found a pencil check mark next to Jacob Sharp Wetmore's name, Jacob Sharp Wetmore and John S. Barnes, and it indicated they were trustees of the Houston Great Northern Railroad, and they had purchased some property from the railroad themselves. So they sold property from the railroad to themselves. My cell phone rang at that time, and found out later that the lady who had been having the dreams was at work, and one of her customers saw a t-shirt she had on that had a train on it. He asked about her interest in trains. They talked about the Texas Transportation Museum, which is located in Wetmore, Texas, and she Googled Wetmore, Texas, and found out that Wetmore, Texas was founded by Jacob Sharp Wetmore. And she was trying to call me at the same time that I was discovering it with the clerk at the courthouse. Well, as it turns out, when I do more research on Jacob Wetmore, he established the towns of Goodwin and Hunter, which are all in Comal County, and they have the exact same layout. There are 5 streets, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th Street. There's lots right on the railroad, and then there's lots back behind the railroad. So obviously he was developing, he and this John Barnes was the president of the railroad at the time. They were developing towns, creating towns, and selling commercial property on the frontage where the railroad was, and then residential property back behind. John Barnes became president, by the way, after the previous president of the Board of Trustees had been murdered. And there were 3 people that Jacob Wetmore was personally associated with who had been murdered. 2 of them were on the Board of Trustees, and one of them was his cousin with whom he was partners in the lumber business. So who is Jacob? The name was said very clearly, Jacob. Well, in German you would pronounce it Jakob. I puzzled around about that for quite a while and then figured out, well, he's not German. When you trace him back to his roots, he comes from New Jersey, and trace his family further back. They fought in the Revolutionary War. I'm pretty sure the Wetmores were English. They certainly were not German. Unfortunately, I have no paper connection between Emma Bartels and Jacob Wetmore, and I'd like to have a paper connection because I can't prove that they knew each other unless they belonged to a church group or an organization or had business together some kind of way. Now, she was a German housewife out in the hill country, some 15 miles away from downtown New Braunfels. So the chances of her running into him would be pretty slim unless she ran into him at a festival or a parade or some kind of celebration, which they had. I went into the Comal County Courthouse Annex one time, and there's this big giant photograph on the wall. And I was looking at the pictures. This picture was taken back at the turn of the century between the 1800s and 1900s. And I saw somebody on there that I thought looked like Emma. Standing next to her was a guy that looked like Herman. Same body type. He was larger than her. She was kind of a petite woman. And we have 2 photographs of her that we know are her. One when she was 70. She and Herman had I think it was a 50th wedding anniversary. Everybody came to this anniversary, the living kids and their spouses. What was interesting in the newspaper clipping is that they did not identify Emma by name. They said it was Herman and Mrs. Bartels, but didn't use the word Emma. The other photograph that we have of her, she was considerably younger. We don't know the date of the photo, but we're thinking that she was about 30, 35, maybe even 40 in that photo. And she's quite an attractive woman. Who's Emma? In 2008, 2015, 2016, we got clues that Emma is the entity that's reaching out to us. We don't know that for sure, but we certainly got the grave pointed out, which said that Lilly was the daughter of Herman and Emma Bartels. We had the dream of May 7th, 2015, and subsequent days. That dream was repeated several times. In that dream, Emma's face was clear and apparent. The young woman who reported this to me said that she had a very clear image of what she'd look like. And so I had an idea, and on May 13th, 2015, I set up a photo lineup. I went onto the internet, I got 15 random photos from that period. People dressed in 1899 clothing. 1899 hairdos. These were pictures, vintage pictures that I carefully selected off the internet to go into a photo lineup, and in that photo lineup I included what I knew was Emma Bartels' photograph. We sat down, I ran the cameras, and we did a test where I pulled the pictures out of an envelope, placed them on the table, and asked her if she could identify anybody from any of those pictures that she saw in her dream. Within 60 seconds or less, she chose Emma Bartels from the lineup. There was another woman who happens to be Nellie Bly, by the way. I didn't know that at the time. Nellie Bly, who is the individual that worked for a newspaper in that period of time, who traveled around the world by herself. She wanted to see if she could do it in 80 days. She did it less than that. Nellie Bly is also the one that infiltrated a mental institution in order to show how horrible the conditions were. She got in and she almost didn't get out. And she wrote a book about it. And I didn't know any of this at the time. It was just a picture I picked. I didn't know it was Nellie Bly. But Nellie Bly had some features that were similar to Emma Bartels, but they weren't quite right. As my friend pointed out, the picture that she chose, which was Emma Bartels, had the correct nose, the correct eyebrows, the correct eyes, and she was totally sure that that was a person that she saw in her dream. Now that is extremely significant. That was a scientific approach to figure out who the entity is. So I'm convinced that we're dealing with Emma Bartels. And if that's the case, that makes total sense, because the Lilly Bartels grave was pointed out, and there was the suggestion in 2008 that there was an injustice. So if Lilly was murdered, that would be an injustice. We both concluded from talking about the dreams that we were talking about a situation where there was probably foul play. Who did it exactly is not clear. I became convinced that it was Jacob who did it, but there's no way you can actually prove that. We're just putting circumstantial evidence together. It looks like the guy that was flailing with something in the river was a railroad person. Well, Jacob Sharp Wetmore was a railroad person. He was not big. The person flailing in the river was not big like Herman. Herman was a tall man, and you can tell that from the two pictures we have of him. We have one of him individually and one of him sitting next to Emma. He was a tall man, and the person at the river who was called Jacob was not tall. The fact that I was on the Bartels Ranch in 1996 is intriguing because the ranch has the Guadalupe River running to the south, and it has a creek on the east. The dream suggested that the person we think was Emma was walking real fast through the trees, hurrying over to the creek, and when she saw what was going on, she screamed out, "Jacob." And it was described as a creek, not as the river. The Guadalupe River is quite a bit wider than the creek that runs across the ranch there. Now, one of the questions that we should ask is, who on earth is Lilly? Who's Lilly? Well, the grave was pointed out October 24, 2008. As I researched her, I found out that her identity was missing from a lot of the records. There are Herman and Emma Bartels' children listed in different places. Sometimes Lilly is not on the list. I mean, several times she's not on the list. I don't know why that would be. Why aren't the lists the same? Why aren't they complete? Well, I did talk to one of the descendants in person who lives here locally, and I asked the question about how the children died, because at that point I was aware that Ida, Alex, and Lilly all died at a young age, and he said he wasn't sure, but he would check with a family member. He got back to me and said that Alex died from eating green apples. He said Ida died when they were in the process of boiling a hog in a big black pot, and the pot fell over and scalded her to death. But he said they didn't know anything about a Lilly, that he thought were confused that there was a Tilly Starts, and we think there was a Lilly Starts too, but not a Lilly Bartels. He said, well, we don't know anything about a Lilly Bartels. And yet when you go there, the grave is very clear. It states that she is the daughter of Herman and Emma Bartels. So that makes you ask the question, was Lilly an illegitimate child from an affair? I mean, I hate to even say that, but there's evidence pointing in that direction. Lilly was quite young when she died. She was born in 1894, died in 1899. She might have started developing features that look like the father. Could it be the features were not similar to the other kids and perhaps not the same as Herman? Could it be that she started to look like Jacob? And Jacob, being a prominent businessman in New Braunfels and a businessman in New York, a man who had a family in New York, a wife and 2 kids in New York, could it be that it was necessary for him to get rid of Lilly, even though it was his child? Could it be that Herman found out that the child was illegitimate and he got rid of it? But that doesn't explain what's going on in the creek, because Herman was not at the creek, Jacob was. There is this question, what happened to Lilly? Why does this entity point out that grave and present to us the concept that there was an injustice? Could it be that Emma knows who murdered Lilly, and when she told people, they said, don't be saying that about the prominent New Braunfels railroad trustee? Or don't be saying whatever you're saying about your husband? Is that why in 1936 they put her in the Comal Sanitarium and left her there until her death in 1962? That certainly would have been an injustice. It's hard to know what the truth is, but we're certainly looking for it. Man, listen to this place. I think it's time for me to very carefully go back down the steps the same way I got up here It's all boarded up. I mean, you can see a little bit through the windows. It's dark and windy. And I don't want to step on a board that's rotten and go plummeting all the way down to the bottom. That would not be good. I'm Douglas Kirk.